Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on the time zone from which you're joining us today. I'm Bill Roebuck, Executive Vice President of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. We're delighted to welcome our audience to this discussion on succession issues and broader political developments in Iran. We're joined by AGSIW scholars Ali Alfoneh and Hussein Ibish. Let me introduce them briefly. Ali Alfoneh is a senior fellow at AGSIW. He's the creator and author of AGSIW's Iran Media Watch, a new feature on our website, and he's a frequent contributor of analytical pieces for AGSIW and other media. Ali has previously been a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute, among other affiliations. He is the author of Iran Unveiled: How the Revolutionary Guard are Transforming Iran from Theocracy into Military Dictatorship. And most recently, and appropriately for today's discussion, Political Succession in the Islamic Republic of Iran, Demise of the Clergy and the Rise of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. His intense and systematic focus on the pivotal role of the IRGC and that institution's outsized influence on Iranian politics and exercise of authority, Ali is extremely well placed to consider questions of succession in Iran and the distorting and likely dominant role the IRGC will play in the selection of Iran's next supreme leader. He brings to these issues the honed skills of a political scientist and the enthusiastic embrace of the history of key institutions in Iran as a helpful guide for future developments. Our moderator today, Hussein Ibish, is a senior resident scholar at AGSIW. He writes regularly for our website and is a regular weekly columnist for Bloomberg and The National in the UAE. Hussein is also a regular contributor to many other US and Middle Eastern publications. Hussein has made thousands of radio and television appearances, and he was at one time Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Daily Star out of Beirut. He's the author of numerous books and major studies, including What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda? Why Ending the Occupation and Peace with Israel is Still the Palestinian National Goal. Hussein, with those introductions, over to you and Ali.
Thanks, Bill. I really appreciate it. What a timely discussion we're having today, and we couldn't have a better scholar and expert to help guide us through these issues than Ali Alfoneh. It's been a real pleasure to have worked with him in recent years, and he's sort of been my professor on all things Iran, especially Iran's internal politics, which I have only a very weak grasp of, not knowing any Farsi and not knowing much about Iran. But one of the most important sort of textbooks for the current situation is Ali's book that was published in 2020 for AGSIW. In-house publication, Political Succession in the Islamic Republic of Iran, Demise of the Clergy and the Rise of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And this is what it looks like, and it's easily available, and it is the book about the current situation. I keep referring obliquely to the current situation, and I'm going to let Ali describe it rather than grasping at it myself. I'm just going to ask him, Ali, we're here to talk about succession in Iran today, right? Why are we talking about it today? What happened last week and the week before that prompted us to have this conversation at this moment? What's going on?
Very good morning to you both, and thank you very much for your generous introduction of me and my work. Thank you for providing me with this opportunity to share my analysis with you and the audience online and later on the website. We are talking about Mr. Khamenei and political succession in Iran because the institution of leadership is an important institution within Iran. Mr. Khamenei is 83 years old. He was hospitalized last week. There were some rumors that his health was deteriorating. And Mr. Khamenei has no successor designate, which means that unlike the American president, who has the vice president and then the Speaker of the House in line of political succession, the Islamic Republic will be immediately thrown into a political crisis if the leader of the Islamic Republic is no longer capable of running the state, or perhaps dies. So these are the reasons that anytime there is rumor about the health of Mr. Khamenei, there will be many, many speculations, because of the simple reason that there is no successor designate. Beside that, there is also some discussion and some concern about if the next leader will actually be found according to the constitution of the Islamic Republic, which explains the succession, or the system will cheat and some strong group within the regime will impose its candidate on the system. Mr. Khamenei himself, he cheated. He did not follow the rules of succession according to the constitution. And lastly, the Islamic Republic obviously is going through a political and social crisis. It is no longer in sync with the Iranian society, as we have seen with the protests of brave Iranian women demanding voluntary hijab. It is not prohibition of the hijab that they are demanding. They are demanding to wear the hijab voluntarily and not as a part of legislation which is arbitrarily enforced in such a way that a 23, 22-year-old girl is killed, beaten to death while in police custody. So these are the reasons that we are talking about Mr. Khamenei and political succession after him.
We'll get to the protests obviously a bit later, but you've made the point that not only did Khamenei and his supporters cheat essentially and do something extra constitutional, so to speak, to get him in power, it's also the case that his predecessor and the founding supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, came into power under very dubious circumstances where there was really no constitutional order in place, and in a manner that leapfrogged a lot of people who theoretically were clerically a lot more senior. So that's, it's a very interesting point that even when you have these structures in place in a system like the Islamic Republic's one, it doesn't mean when everything is at stake, they get followed at all. Both times they didn't. So what I'd like you to do at this point is walk us through the constitutional process. What if the process were followed? What would have happened, right? If Khamenei had died or been incapacitated, what would have taken place this week and next week and in the weeks following?
Following the Constitution, what would happen was an interregnum where a group of 3 individuals, a council, interregnum council, would be ruling the Islamic Republic. That council would be composed of the president of the republic, the head of the judiciary, and 1 theologian from the Guardian Council. These 3 individuals, they would be making a so-called collective leadership for a short period of time. And within a short period of time, which is, by the way, not defined further in the Constitution, the Assembly of Experts, which is a body composed of 8 theologians, they would be electing a successor for Mr. Khamenei as the leader of the Islamic Republic. Now, that leader needs to live up to certain qualifications as explained in the Constitution, but all those qualifications are very subjective. For example, piety. The next leader has to be pious. But how do you manage to judge if an individual a cleric is enough pious to become the leader of the Islamic Republic. At one of the discussions of the Constitution, there was one of the senior clerics joking that in the Islamic Republic, we are so technologically advanced that we have even invented a piety meter. Just like the Westerners have a thermometer, we have a piety meter for our leaders. Another qualification, which is just as subjective to judge and assess, is administrative capacity. So they need somebody who is also capable of running the affairs of the state. But that, of course, is also very subjective whenever the Assembly of Experts is discussing possible candidates for leadership. Now, I do not want to tire you with how Mr. Khamenei himself broke the rules. Just to say that Mr. Khamenei did not live up to the constitutional requirements, which were being a source of emulation, a so-called marja taqlid. He was just a junior cleric. Right. So what they did was to say that Mr. Khamenei was going to be temporary leader, something that does not exist in the Constitution. You are either a leader or you're not a leader. And the next thing was that once he was elected temporary leader, they changed the Constitution retroactively. Yeah. So he would be living up to the new Constitution's requirements. So these are the things that I'm expecting next time around. The Constitution will be changed retroactively to live up to the qualifications of whoever wins the struggle for power within the system of the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, it's very interesting because Ayatollah Khamenei was also not a marja either. And so you've had two leaders who kind of leapfrogged that little requirement.
As a political scientist, it's a little bit difficult for me to talk about, theological matters. But there are some theologians who believe that, Grand Ayatollah Khamenei indeed was a source of emulation. But that is, a debate that I happily leave for the theologians.
Yes, me neither. So let me just ask you a technical question. I know you want to avoid them, but it's a source of confusion outside of Iran. Except for those people who take the time to study it. So, I mean, this is the last technical question I'm going to ask it. Can you explain quickly the difference between the Guardian Council and the Assembly of Experts? What are they? What do they do, et cetera? Because it's easy to get these things mixed up, and these are uniquely Iranian institutions. So just quickly walk us through this.
The Assembly of Experts is an 88-man large body which was discussing the Constitution of the Islamic Republic and the revision of the Constitution, under the Constitution in 1979 and the revision of the Constitution in 1989. And this institution is also tasked with electing the leader of the Islamic Republic, identifying a leader. And by the way, we are told that right now they are trying to identify suitable candidates to succeed Mr. Khamenei, but very few members of the Assembly of Experts are aware of who those candidates are, and the bigger public has no idea who those individuals
Would you say at this point you have no idea?
I do not know. And when Mr. Khamenei was elected leader back in 1989, no one outside of a very, very small group of individuals was aware that Mr. Khamenei was a candidate. It came as a shock to the entire world because he did not live up to the basic qualifications in the Constitution. So what happened was a political coup in reality, that a very small group managed to impose its candidate on the system in its entirety. And the Guardian Council is a different body. The Guardian Council is an institution which selects and needs to verify and vet individuals who try to run for various offices in the Islamic Republic, including the Assembly of Experts, so that ideologically undesirable elements are not elected into office. And Mr. Khamenei himself is very careful about purging these councils of elements with whom he disagrees. So engineering the composition of the Assembly of Experts will have some importance for who will be the next leader of the regime.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how much Carl Schmitt there is in all of this. It's really amazing, which bolsters the the case of some people who want to say this is a version of fascism, but that doesn't really matter again. You were going to say something, or should we move on?
We can move on, but the one thing that I was very interested in discussing was the differences between today and back in 1989 when Khamenei was elected.
I think that's very important, because we also do have a question which you basically answered from one of our viewers. How did he manage to do it if he wasn't qualified? And you sort of answered that. But yeah, talk then about the differences between the last time we faced a succession and the next time we're going to, because it can't be that far off given, human life expectancy.
Well, I think it may be of some interest, to discuss, why Mr. Khamenei, of all these people in the Islamic Republic, he was not particularly prominent. Yes, he was president, but back then in the 1980s, the presidency was a ceremonial position. He was not the head of the executive, branch. The executive branch back then was led by the prime minister. So why Mr. Khamenei? The answer is very simple. In 1980, Mr. Khomeini, Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, suffered a massive heart attack. He was hospitalized, and some of the clerics very close to him, particularly Mr. Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, they wanted to find out, they wanted to have a small group of individuals who could manage the affairs of the state while Mr. Khomeini was hospitalized and was incapable of running the matters of the state. It was impossible for him. Mr. Rafsanjani had a friend from his youth time, Mr. Khamenei. So Mr. Rafsanjani as the Speaker of the Parliament, Mr. Khamenei as President, and also a gentleman called Mousavi Ardebili, who was the head of the judiciary. They became more or less a triumvirate, managing the affairs of the state in the absence of Mr. Khomeini. They were doing the day-to-day affairs of the state. In order to legitimize their work, they would also be cooperating with Mr. Ahmad Khomeini, who was the son of Grand Ayatollah Khomeini. And Mr. Ahmad would always use the seal of his father so they could sign and stamp documents that these three individuals had passed. Now, they wanted to, after when it was apparent that Mr. Khomeini was passing away, they wanted to establish a collective leadership in the new constitution so that there would be three individuals themselves, running the affairs of the state as a collective leadership. But the Assembly of Experts in discussions of the constitution said, no, we only want to have one individual as the head of state. And Mr. Rafsanjani found it more politic, more expedient to have Mr. Khamenei as the leader of the Islamic Republic. He could himself become the president of the Islamic Republic, and there would be a power sharing agreement between the two. So friendship between Mr. Rafsanjani and Mr. Khamenei led to election of Mr. Khamenei as leader of the Islamic Republic. Mr. Rafsanjani used his entire political network and energy and talent in order to get Mr. Khamenei elected. So that was because of the manipulations of Mr. Rafsanjani that Mr. Khamenei became the leader.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, that's a very thorough and informative explanation. So now we've got this situation where you have described in your work over recent years that Iran is essentially been, or the Islamic Republic is essentially experiencing a slow motion and underappreciated transition from a kind of clerically centered theocratic rule based on clerical authority into what amounts to a military dictatorship, or at least a national security state dominated by the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Can you explain briefly how that idea, we'll get into the details of that idea a little more, but I want you to talk about how the current question of succession, right, and the basic issue of power and who will retain it and who will have it and what have you when succession comes, how does this rise of the power of national security state and IRGC, if I'm right in calling it a national security state, by the way, you may take issue with that, how does that factor in?
So that is the big difference between now and the succession in 1989. Back then, in 1989, the Revolutionary Guard did not play any role. The Revolutionary Guard was subjected to civilian control. It was like the Red Army in the Soviet Union, the Red Army and People's Liberation Army in China were both under and are still in China are under subjected to civilian control of the Communist Party. Now, the problem today, and actually since 1989, is that Ayatollah Khamenei, as soon as he became leader, he was very afraid that the very same individual who brought him into office, meaning Mr. Rafsanjani, would also have the power to remove him from power. So what he did systematically and gradually and very patiently was to bring in the Revolutionary Guard into Iranian politics and to Iran's economy in order to have a second source of support. So he was not only dependent on the Rafsanjani network, he would also be dependent on and rely on support base from the Revolutionary Guard. That is the really big difference. So Iran gradually changed from a political system in which the clerical elites were ruling the Islamic Republic, and these rulers were protected against internal and external enemies by the Revolutionary Guard, into a system where the Revolutionary Guard increasingly is both protecting the regime against internal and external enemies, but also ruling it. This is the biggest difference. And this is not so surprising. In most developing countries, we do see that whenever civilian institutions are weak, the military institution is more or less the only and the sole functioning, well-functioning institution in the state. Look at neighboring Pakistan. We have the same problem. Weak civilian institutions, very strong military. The military is channeling the resources of the state to different sectors of society, and is ruling indirectly over the political system. This is something similar that we are witnessing today in Iran.
So you're absolutely right. This is typical of developing certain types of developing countries, which have struggled with various aspects of development, political and economic development, so that you end up with a strong military that no one else can control. But in Iran, you have, since the revolution, and maybe in some ways it's an even heightened version of the kind of thing you saw in some Leninist countries, that you have kind of Noah's Ark in government, two of everything, right? A state framework, a structure that was inherited from the Shah, that the Shah inherited from earlier, et cetera, that is sort of there, including the military. And then you have the revolutionary counterpart, right, which is there throughout the system, right? And so the IRGC and Basij groups and all that represent that, the revolutionary military force. So can you talk about how that works, and why will the military, the regular military, have a part in this, or is it going to be really the revolutionary elements that are going to control this power?
You are absolutely right that Iran and certain other countries do have a system of parallel institutions with overlapping fields of responsibility. And that rivalry between the institutions keeps both of them in check. And usually the leaders of this type of regimes, they are like a pendulum. Whenever one institution is too strong, they support the counterpart in order to keep the entire system in check. But in the Iranian system, Mr. Khamenei has become just too dependent on the Revolutionary Guard, because the system has been pressured from the society within Iran and from abroad. From abroad, Mr. Khamenei sees enemies everywhere. The Islamic Republic is a country which is living under the sanctions regime from the United States. The Islamic Republic is a state which is in a state of rivalry with Israel, has poor relations with certain Arab countries. So in other words, the leadership of the Islamic Republic and the ruling elites of the Islamic Republic, they perceive themselves and the Iranian state as a state in a state of almost war. So there is always the external enemy that you need to protect the system against. But there is also an internal opposition, an internal enemy that we are seeing these days exactly. Women and a generation of young people who no longer share the values of the Islamic Republic. In this regard, by the way, the Islamic Republic resembles the regime of the Shah. What was the problem, fundamental problem of the Iranian monarchy? Well, it was that the Shah of Iran wanted to and successfully managed to modernize Iranian society. So you would have a population which is living in big cities, which is well educated, had access to information. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians were educated abroad at universities, including here in the United States of America. And the Shah of Iran expected all these extremely well-educated, well-informed, middle-class Iranians would come back to him and say, Your Majesty, you're right. We do not want to have any political rights. You make the decisions for us. Of course, this is impossible. Such a thing would never happen. Right. And the Islamic Republic is experiencing a similar development. Under the Islamic Republic, perhaps not by design, but it is a truth that we have a majority of students at universities who are women. Iranian women today are better educated than Iranian men. Majority of Iranians live in big cities. Iranians have access to the internet. They have access to the information. And Mr. Khamenei wants to be the guardian jurist of these people. He wants to tell them that they do not have any political rights because he, as guardian jurist, this Platonian philosopher, king of Iran, he knows everything better. This is the foundation of the crisis that the Islamic Republic is living through. Therefore, the Islamic Republic has problems very similar to the problems that the Shah's regime was experiencing. Just before having this discussion, I was going through my books at the library, and I came upon this book, not my own, but a fantastic volume by the late Professor George Lenchovsky, Iran under the Pahlavis, in which Professor Lenchovsky predicted that the Pahlavi regime would be capable of transferring power peacefully from father, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to his son, the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, and the regime would have at least 54 years to rule. Now, unfortunately for Professor Lenchovsky, the book was published in 1978. And a few months after the book was published, the entire system collapsed. Now, with the little book that I have published, I am aware of changes happening in Iran. I am aware of societal change and transformation of the society. But I do not yet believe that the Islamic Republic is just about to collapse. I do believe there will be a change in Iran, but it would not be a regime collapse. It would be transformation of the Islamic Republic from a regime where the clerics make the political decisions and the IRGC protects it against internal and external enemies into a military dictatorship.
Okay, so let's talk then about the protests that are going on today, because we can't ignore the fact that there were protests and there was a crackdown, and the crackdown produced bigger protests, especially a protest now focused on a martyr. Mahsa Amini, I suppose is how you might pronounce it, who was killed in police custody, beaten, as you said, beaten to death, after protests over the law making the hijab mandatory, covering of hair for women mandatory, and the protesters wanted to make it a voluntary issue. So this is only the latest of protests that were political, after the Green Movement a little bit more than 10 years ago. And then they were economic a few years ago, involving drought, water, and fuel, right? And they've been, they've sort of gripped hold of different issues. But as you say, they don't seem to have ever coalesced into what looks like a revolutionary situation. So can you talk about what's going on the streets right now inside Iran? And help us understand it in context, the context that I referred to now about the history of unrest in in the past 10 years, 12 years inside Iran that never seems to produce anything except tremors, that make people nervous.
As you correctly explained, fundamentally, there are two reasons for which Iranians take their protest to the streets. One is bread, and the other is freedom. And these are two different groups usually, expressing these demands. The middle class has traditionally protested in order to get more freedoms, and the more underprivileged classes, have been protesting because of economic reasons. We have seldom seen cases where both groups united in a joint front against the regime. One exception, I would say, was the Green Movement in 2009, where the middle classes were outraged that Mr. Ahmadinejad was, won a, contested, or if you want, fraudulent election, and the underprivileged Iranians, they were outraged at the rich and corrupt clerical regime, which is not, and has not, their interest at heart. So these two groups united in 2009, and 2009 was a very, very serious incident for the Islamic Republic, and I genuinely do believe that it was bigger than any protest that we saw in the Arab world, during the Arab Spring.
No doubt.
So that was, million-man large, marches, in the streets of Tehran. Today, we are getting closer to a similar situation because Iran's middle class has been impoverished because of Iran's nuclear policy and the international and US-led sanctions regime. So the middle class believes that nowadays they have nothing to lose. So more or less, they're in the same situation as the underprivileged classes. They have been impoverished. And the impoverished classes, they more or less feel that they have nothing to lose, by going to the streets. So anything they do is better than just sitting at home. So it is now legitimate, for these two groups to join forces and go into the streets. And this is what we are seeing. And this is also why that the Islamic Republic is in trouble. Now, the big question, obviously, is if the infrastructure of suppression that the Islamic Republic has developed and the Shah's lacked in 1979, because back then they committed the same mistake as Bashar al-Assad by sending in the regular military to the streets of Iran, particularly the streets of Tehran. And those people, they were not trained in suppressing the opposition and domestic unrest. They were professional soldiers. Right. The Islamic Republic is not committing that mistake. But the big question still to me is if we will have people who simply do not follow orders. We have seen many cases of policemen, members of the law enforcement forces, in the course of the past couple of days, not fighting. But on the other hand, we have yet to see large forces of the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij, starting this serious suppression of the protesters, which I suspect has to do with President Raisi's visit to New York. As soon as he's back, in Tehran, and there will be less of a scandal in the United States and in the international community, when there is less focus on Iran, the Islamic Republic, this regime, they will use a greater degree of violence. And I do not believe that it is just like the Shah's regime. This regime has nowhere to flee, and they will fight, and it is going to be a very, very ugly period of time.
I've got a question, which is really interesting, which is about whether the degree of homogeneity within the IRGC, within the national security elements, the kind of military dictatorship elements that represent right now the power behind the throne, and probably will again after succession if your model sustains itself, not if it's correct, because it is correct, but if it persists in being the case. So could you talk a little bit about the different factions within this group in Iran?
You're absolutely right. In any organization, and especially in any military organization, which is highly politicized, as the case is with the Revolutionary Guard, we end up seeing a degree of factionalism. We have ideological factions, but we even have groups within the Revolutionary Guard whose worldview is shaped by their function within the organization. For example, because the Revolutionary Guard has such a large degree of involvement in Iran's economy, there is an economic sector within the Revolutionary Guard which is pursuing an agenda which is not necessarily the same agenda as those in charge of the internal security and intelligence service of the Revolutionary Guard. Just to give you one example, some years ago, there was some cases of small employers in Iran's underdeveloped and marginalized Sistan and Baluchistan province, next to the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. In those regions, the Revolutionary Guard economic sector wanted to stop economic activities because it was not profitable. That was the bureaucratic logic of the economic people, people working in the economic part of the Revolutionary Guard. Now, the security people and national security people and intelligence service of the Revolutionary Guard, they opposed seizing economic activities in the process in that province, because they said that there is already so much unemployment in this process in this province, and now you want to shut down your economic businesses in this province. So just to say that within the Revolutionary Guard, obviously, there are differences. Some of these differences are motivated by politics and ideology. Some of these differences are motivated by the different functions that the individual officers have within the system. Now, however, my analysis also shows that whenever they want to achieve their goal, they need to stick together. Otherwise, the entire ship goes down. And this is something that you see in any military organization trying to achieve power through a coup. I am sure that even in Augusto Pinochet's army, the military, there were different factions. Nevertheless, they had to stick together, in order to get rid of Allende.
His coup began with the murder of his senior officer. So, of course, there were differences,
Exactly. So my point is that the military institution, they end up sticking together in spite of differences amongst them, because otherwise the entire ship goes down. But I do understand that those people who, either within the political system within Iran or outside of Iran, who want to play on those differences in order to weaken the Revolutionary Guard as an institution, this definitely is a place and an opportunity which can be exploited.
We have another question, very interesting. Is there any chance of a reformer coming to power? I mean, you paint a rather bleak picture from the point of view of those who want, a liberalization in Iran, or a more normal state in Iran, more normative.
I am sorry if this is how I have been perceived, because the explanation I'm trying to give is somewhat different. What I'm trying to say is that the Revolutionary Guard, I'm not entirely sure it matters too much if the person coming to power belongs to this or that faction. But the person needs to live up to the demands of the Revolutionary Guard, particularly when it comes to the economy. One of the reasons that the Revolutionary Guard has a bad relationship with large parts of the reformist camp within the Islamic Republic, particularly technocrats like Mr. Rouhani, before Mr. President Rouhani, President Rafsanjani. One of the reasons they have a difficult time with these individuals is that the technocrats try to control the Revolutionary Guard. They tried very, very hard to impose controls and impose civilian control over the military institution. Mr. Rouhani himself, he started his parliamentary career in 1980 by being extremely active in parliamentary debates about imposing controls on the Revolutionary Guard in 1980, 1981, as early as those years. Mr. Rafsanjani, he tried to stay away from that debate. He would give it to Mr. Rouhani, so Mr. Rouhani would take the fight with the Revolutionary Guard. But both of them were involved. Even Mr. Khamenei, before he became leader in 1989, Mr. Khamenei too was trying to control the Revolutionary Guard. Mr. Khamenei and Mr. Rafsanjani and Mr. Rouhani, all three of them were instrumental in establishing Iran's Ministry of Intelligence, because before that, establishment of the intelligence ministry, the Revolutionary Guard was the only it's serious. There was another, intelligence organization, under the Prime Minister's office, but the bigger and the biggest intelligence organization was that of the Revolutionary Guard. Mr. Khamenei, Mr. Rafsanjani, Mr. Rouhani, they established an intelligence ministry in spite of all the protests from the Revolutionary Guard. So these people, they are aware of the threat of a coup. They are aware that, this military organization, if you give them too much power, they will be completely outside of control. So it's not that they are not aware of it. And this is also why that the Revolutionary Guard is against those individuals who try to control it. But any reformist politician trying to make a deal with the Revolutionary Guard could do it, but it is going to be a bargaining process, which is not going to be particularly easy for any politician, hardliner or softliner. It doesn't matter, really.
So their interests could be served by someone from either orientation, is what you're saying, correct?
Yes, because okay. I still believe, and this is also important to say, I still believe that the Revolutionary Guard thinks its interests are better served by having a clerical figure as the head of state in Iran, rather than having an outright, military dictatorship with men in uniform running the affairs of the state. Because if they do such a thing, they will have legitimacy issues, and they will also be blamed for all the ills and shortcomings of the state. Right now, there actually is a clerical figurehead who is getting, it is his photos, his banners, Mr. Khamenei's banners being taken down by the angry woman of Iran in the streets. It is not, IRGC banner. So in some way, I do believe that having a clerical figurehead who is more or less serving the interests of the Revolutionary Guard, but also is blamed for the shortcomings of the state, is in the interest of the IRGC.
Yeah, it's a perfect arrangement to have the power without the responsibility.
Exactly.
It's ideal. What's the relationship of this set of power interests to the JCPOA negotiations, and specifically, are there factional divisions that we can see within IRGC and related movements in Iran regarding JCPOA and nuclear talks, or not? And I'd like you to talk about all those things.
It's a fantastic question. My answer will be somewhat speculative, because the fact of the matter is that we do not have access to primary source material giving us direct answers. We can make assumptions. We can take a look at statements by members of the IRGC, and then we can also have a qualified speculation about these matters.
Educated guess.
Educated guesses, yes. And my educated guess would be that, yes, of course, it would be in the interest of the Revolutionary Guard to see Iran as a nuclear-armed state, because the Revolutionary Guard will be the custodian of Iran's bomb. If we compare Iran with neighboring Pakistan, it was not the civilian politicians who benefited from the prestige of Pakistan being a nuclear power. It was the Pakistani military. Sure. And the Revolutionary Guard, definitely, I do believe that they think that an Iranian nuclear bomb would serve their interests, and it would enhance their prestige in society. And by the way, I have no doubt, that the day that we see the nuclear mushroom cloud over the Iranian deserts, there will be nationalism. There will be Iranians being proud of Iran achieving the bomb, because many Iranians, believe that the nuclear bomb is a short way to greatness, a shortcut to being equal to Western societies. Nobody thinks that my schools, my children's school is not going to be better because now we are a nuclear power. Nobody thinks about that. Nobody thinks that, I'm not going to eat 3 meals, tomorrow because we are a nuclear power. But there is something called nationalism and national pride, and there will be a nationalist moment if there is an Iranian nuclear bomb. So it is in the interest of the IRGC that Iran becomes a nuclear power. However, we also know that the Revolutionary Guard did not veto the JCPOA. There were discussions, but the IRGC, in the Supreme National Security Council, the Revolutionary Guard did not veto it. Why? Because the Revolutionary Guard expected that the lifting of the sanctions because of the JCPOA, would also benefit the Revolutionary Guard's economic empire. And they also believed that there would be joint ventures in Iran between IRGC, companies either wholly or partially owned and controlled by the Revolutionary Guard, and foreign companies. They were expecting to attract foreign direct investment. So in other words, even within the Revolutionary Guard, there must have been some reasoning weighing up the risk and benefits of opting either for the JCPOA or for going for the nuclear weapon. And in the JCPOA case, clearly they did not veto it. They accepted it.
Yeah. No, we have another question that's very interesting. I'm just going to read it because it gets into stuff I don't know that much about. But it says, last Tuesday, Ayatollah Khamenei appointed members for a new term of the Expediency Council. Under the backdrop of the impending leadership succession, how do you view the retention of those sidelined during the last presidential election and having expressed their frustrations in this regard, such as Chairman Amuli Larijani and members such as Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Ali Larijani?
So what we have seen is the collapse of the fortunes, decline of the fortunes of the Larijani family. The Larijani family used to be extremely, successful, extremely powerful within the political system in the Islamic Republic. They were more or less representatives of the so-called Iraqi Iranians, previously represented by Ayatollah Shahroudi. Ayatollah Shahroudi was more or less the head of the Iraqi Iranian mafia, if you want. These were hundreds of thousands of Iranians who were thrown out of Iraq. In late 1970s and early 1980s, they came to Iran. They were dual nationals of Iran and Iraq, but they were Arabic speakers. For all practical purposes, they were Iraqis who were thrown out of Iraq, but they had Iranian origin, or they were dual nationals. Ayatollah Shahroudi and the Larijani family, they belong to these elite groups. And these elite groups, they managed to do very well in Iran because, the Iran-Iraq war, there was, the Iranian state needed Arabic speakers, and these people were native Arabic speakers. So they got very important positions in the military, in the Revolutionary Guard, in the intelligence services. And the Larijani family's fortunes were made, because of this connection and because of the prominence and the usefulness of the Arabic-speaking Iranians who were thrown out of Iraq. And by the way, the Islamic Republic trusted them, these group of people, much more than Iranians living in Iran, because this group, they had already lost Iraq. If the Islamic Republic also collapsed, they had nowhere else to go. So they got preferential treatment. That era, I think, has come to an end, and we have seen the demise of the Larijani family. Mr. Ahmadinejad has a very strange political destiny. He is ideologically flexible, if I may say it in a polite way. He is an opportunist who managed to persuade Mr. Khamenei that he's a yes man, but he was not and is not. Mr. Ahmadinejad is a genuine revolutionary, and he's a populist.
Sorry, say that again. You cut out a little bit. A genuine what?
A genuine revolutionary. When Mr. Khamenei was hoping that Mr. Ahmadinejad could only be used against the old clerical elites, the likes of Mr. Rafsanjani, who had become established and wealthy, the families, the so-called aristocracy of the Islamic Republic. And Mr. Khamenei thought that Ahmadinejad could be useful in order to suppress this, so-called aristocracy of the Islamic Republic. But what happened was that Mr. Ahmadinejad not only was against Mr. Rafsanjani, he was also trying to do it away with Mr. Khamenei himself. Mr. Ahmadinejad genuinely believed that he could rely on the Iranian street and manipulate them for his own purposes. So he's tolerated, he's not thrown in jail, he's not under house arrest, perhaps because, he could be useful in the future, but, by giving him some kind of responsibility within the system, they also try to control him. Otherwise, we see a lot of young faces coming into the Assembly of Experts, and these are people who owe their entire political career to Mr. Khamenei. They do not have a popular base. They do not have scientific, qualifications from the theological seminary. Not that I'm an expert in this field, but people who are experts, this is their assessment of the composition of the new Assembly of Experts.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. I mean, we have a couple of people who have asked the same question, which it's a very a question many people have been asking for quite a while now. And you've answered it in the past, but I think our audience would appreciate knowing, do you think that the assassination or killing of Qasem Soleimani in the Baghdad airport, along with al-Muhandas and others, by the Trump administration has weakened the IRGC or changed it fundamentally in any way or not?
In my assessment of the operations and the work and performance of the Quds Force, I do not believe that the Quds Force has become weakened because of the assassination of Major General Soleimani. What we see is extreme weaknesses and weakening of the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, because Mr. Muhandas was sitting next to Mr. Soleimani and he was killed.
Well, he really was indispensable and irreplaceable. Much more.
Exactly. And my point being that the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq is a relatively young organization compared with the Quds Force. It is not as institutionalized as the Quds Force is.
It's inherently fragmented. Yeah.
It is fragmented. They had difficulties finding a leadership. Even today, the leadership, is disputed within the system. So they have been going through many problems, in Iraq, in the Popular Mobilization Forces. This has not been the case in the Quds Force. Within 24 hours, Brigadier General Ghani, he was elevated into head of the organization, and that was really the end of it. Now, what we also have seen is that the Quds Force has, when it comes to its operational conduct, it has gone to classical times. In other words, during the beginning of the time that Mr. Soleimani was the head of the organization, Quds Force and all other, special operation forces, in the world, they usually operate in the shadows. They are secretive, highly secretive organizations. At some point, I believe in perhaps, 2004, 5, the regime found out that Mr. Soleimani has become a notoriety in the Western press. He was a recognizable face. And they also believed that there was some propaganda value in him because he was personally not economically corrupt. He was a believer in something bigger than himself and his own interest. He was a war hero from the Iran-Iraq war. He was a likable individual from an Iranian perspective, Iranian nationalist perspective. So the Iranian propaganda machinery made him into an individual, a towering figure within the organization. But in reality, he was just a part of the institution. The institution could go on functioning even without Mr. Soleimani. Mr. Soleimani's art was to transform a secretive organization into a mobilization force, into a force mobilizing all young Shia all over the Middle East. That was what he managed to do. But after the killing of, the assassination of Mr. Soleimani, the Quds Force has gone back to its original ways of operating in the shadows and secretive. You no longer see on Instagram or on Twitter photos of Brigadier General Ghani trying to mobilize the public. It's a very different type of leadership and operation that we are seeing. But in my opinion, it is not necessarily weakening of the Quds Force. It is just Quds Force going back to its traditional ways of operating.
Yeah, back to basics. Yeah, right. No, it makes sense. We had a very, very interesting question about whether the clerical establishment in Iran would be very well aware of everything you said about the transformation within the power structure of the elite behind behind the scenes, et cetera, whoever the front person is on posters. They would be aware of the structure of power. Is there any effort or ability or thought in the clerical establishment about reversing this, addressing it, in some ways challenging this?
The Islamic Republic has done something very interesting to the institution of the clergy. And again, I'm talking about something, as a political scientist, I'm not a theologian. There are other people who are more knowledgeable about the functions of theological seminaries and the Shia clergy in Iran. But as a political scientist looking at these things, yes, I do see the clerics being concerned about the powers of the Revolutionary Guard. I do see clerics being concerned that the Revolutionary Guard has established its own theological seminary in Qom. In the old days, clerics became and were appointed as political commissars. They would go into the units of the Revolutionary Guard, just like Communist Party commissars in the Red Army. They would infiltrate and then they would report to their superiors. Nowadays, the Revolutionary Guard has established its own theological seminary, and the commissars who were supported to be the eyes and ears of the leader in the Revolutionary Guard are now the people who were educated at the Revolutionary Guard seminaries. The clerics see these things and they're concerned about this, but they keep quiet. And the truth of the matter, obviously, being that the Shia clergy is not as revolutionary as it claims to be. The Shia clergy has always legitimized those in power. When Shah of Iran was in power, the Iranian clergy would always say that he is the Shia Shah, he's the Shia king, and therefore, because he is the protector of the church, we need to defend him. Yeah. Very few clerics were against the Shah's regime, Mr. Khamenei being one of them. The rest of them, they were living a good, quiet, and comfortable life, cooperating with the intelligence services of the Shah. They were cooperating with the regime. Now they're cooperating with Mr. Khamenei's regime. And when the Revolutionary Guard will be in power, either directly or indirectly, they will be cooperating with the institution of the Revolutionary Guard. The Shia clergy is not as heroic, not as revolutionary, and not as activist as it claims to be.
Right. It's also not armed. So it's very hard for the people who don't have guns to confront and overwhelm the people with all the guns. So yeah, this
is what Grand Ayatollah Khomeini did. Grand Ayatollah Khomeini fought, the revolution without guns. That is why he was a formidable figure. He was ready to pay. He was ready to sacrifice himself and his family. Right. These clerics who are around nowadays, they are government employees. Yeah. The Islamic Republic has done to the Shia clergy the same thing that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk did in Turkey, made them civil servants. This is what has happened to the Shia clergy in Iran.
No, it's a very good point. We're running out of time, but I think we have several questions who are asking whether you think the government in Iran is evolving in a more hardline or softline direction, more open or closed. I don't know if any of these terms are the right ones, but basically more willing to engage with the outside world and more interested in operating according to international norms and be a more normative state. I think that's probably the way I would have put it anyway. So, this whole nexus of ideas, can you address that? Where do you see Iran going, right, under current circumstances?
Right now, I generally do not see any prospects for the Islamic Republic accommodating the wishes of the brave women of Iran. They believe, and they have seen with their own eyes, that the Shah's regime, when it was challenged, it tried to accommodate the protesters. The Shah's regime freed political prisoners, freed the press, so the press could more or less write whatever they wanted. His last prime minister even dissolved the, Sabak, Iran's intelligence service. All those moves emboldened, the domestic opposition and actually hastened the collapse of the imperial regime. The Islamic Republic has learned that lesson, and they will not be giving into pressure from the opposition at this time. They believe that if they give concessions to the opposition, for example, by abolishing the mandatory hijab, there will be more demands from the protesters. And they're correct, to make such an assumption. This is why I do fear that the suppression of the protests will be much harsher in the coming days and perhaps weeks. When it comes to the international environment, I genuinely also believe that, in the short term, it's very hard to see Iran giving concessions. If, and this again has to do with nuclear physics, which is not my field of expertise, but if the Islamic Republic, if the strategic decision makers in Iran are led to believe that they are extremely close to producing a nuclear device, then they would not be giving any concessions to the United States in the nuclear negotiations. Then they would be risk takers. And that would, of course, could potentially start a war in the Middle East between Iran and Israel, and perhaps between Iran and the United States. So in the short term, I do believe that we are going through a very, very difficult period of time with many, many unknown factors. and this is a source of concern to everybody.
I want to ask my last question, just sort of takes off from where that question kind of leaves off. I mean, you speak about the possibility of a war in the Middle East. There's the dialogues going on, not just the nuclear talks, but also in dialogues between Iran and UAE and between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, there's this transition in Iran towards a more military and therefore presumably more militant kind of state. Can you talk about those forces? And also, I want you to address as we start to close, the question of how ideological is the IRGC? How fanatical is this organization? Are they millenarianists? Are they Mahdeists? Are they waiting for the second coming? Are they waiting? Are they yearning for the end of times? What sort of, or are they armed men with pragmatic, practical, cynical ambitions about power and whatnot? So I know I've packed two different things into that. So dialogue and war, but then the ideological sort of degree of fanaticism within the IRGC. So try.
When it comes to the Revolutionary Guard understanding and the lessons the Revolutionary Guard has learned, from dealing with Arab states and the United States and Israel, for that matter, during the past, 4 or 5 years, they genuinely believe that they managed to, survive, the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign. That is a clear win. They believe it was a victory. They believe that they managed to prevail in the war in Syria by securing the survival of the Assad regime, and in doing so, secure the overland corridor, connecting Iran to Lebanon and Iran's Lebanese ally Hezbollah.
But that is not secured yet.
This is their perception. They believe that they won the war. This is they have
a declared goal, but they haven't established a secured corridor.
This is their perception, and they are digging in. They are being bombarded by the Israelis every single week, but they are digging deeper these tunnels, and they believe that they won. This is their perception. When it comes to the Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, they are also drawing the lesson, the strategic lesson that by harassing Saudi Arabia and by harassing the United Arab Emirates and the United States not coming to the aid of Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, in the shipping incident or the attack against the Saudi oil facilities, they managed to change the behavior of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. These two states who were against the JCPOA, now they seem to be in favor of it. Wow. These two states had withdrawn their ambassadors from Iran. Now, United Arab Emirates, has sent back its ambassador, and Iran is negotiating with Saudi Arabia. So the lessons the IRGC has learned is that the hardline approach actually yields results. These are the lessons that they have learned. And therefore, they may be continuing the same path. After all, if you do something and it is successful, or you perceive it as successful action, you will do it again. And when it comes to pragmatism or ideology, what I see is that ideology more often than not it covers the interests, this worldly interests of the Revolutionary Guard, be it economic interest, political interests, attempts at discrediting their political opponents within Iran and like. This is what I have been seeing. The Revolutionary Guard is just as corrupt as the rest of the political system.
Oh, sure.
The people who are hoarding money in foreign banks, they are not trying to prepare for themselves to see God. They believe in this world more than they believe in the next.
Yeah. No, fair enough. I really appreciate it. I want to thank our audience for a set of really, really helpful questions. Some of them were great, and they were all great, and we used quite a few. So Ali, I want to thank you very much. And again, I want to say, if anyone wants to understand the question of succession in Iran and the politics in Iran, this book, right, which is Political Succession in the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Demise of the Clergy and the Rise of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, published by AGSIW is invaluable. So again, let's thank you very much, Ali. Thank all of our viewers, and join us again for our next AGSIW webinar, which will be no doubt extremely soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.